and then had to take an oath to perform whatever they were commanded for the Roman state and not to shrink from death. They were then given 3 gold pieces and sent to the provinces for training. But many of these new, poorer soldiers were already looking beyond 3 gold pieces. As the army kept adding new conquests, soldiers were increasingly focused on the spoils of war.
The amount of booty they were able to bring back from cities like Corinth in 146 BC was so enormous that I think it did encourage massive greed and an increasing level of brutality among Roman soldiers.
Increasingly, soldiers turned their loyalty from the Roman state to their own generals, who could make them rich. And the generals, being Roman aristocrats, saw their legions as tickets to wealth and power.
Intimately related is the general and his army. The general promises his army land, booty, settlement after the war has finished. And the army promises the general not only success in conquest, but votes back in Rome afterwards.
This led to a new class of super generals, all with political ambitions. There was Marius himself, a consul for many years. His rival, Sulla, who won victories in the Eastern Mediterranean and for a time became dictator of Rome. Pompey the Great, who conquered Syria and Palestine. And the most famous general of all, Julius Caesar.
Julius Caesar represents as close as I think you can get to naked ambition in the 1st century BC. There's a famous story of Julius Caesar, aged 31, in further Spain, coming across a statue of that great conqueror Alexander the Great, and suddenly bursting into tears. And his entourage say, "Why, Caesar, are you crying?" And he says, "This man, by my age, had conquered most of the world, and I have done nothing."
But within a few years, the world would know that Caesar had done a great deal. Of all Rome's great generals, none created more fame, bloodshed, loyalty, and hatred than Julius Caesar. He was a nobleman who worked his way up the political ladder and used his military command in Spain to pillage enough booty to buy votes in Rome. He was made a consul and formed a political alliance, the Triumvirate, with a rival general, Pompey, and Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Caesar then had himself made governor of northern Italy and southern France, which made him commander of several legions. He was anxious for more conquests, and his chance soon came. In 58 BC, a Celtic people, the Helvetii, asked Caesar's permission to migrate from Switzerland to western France, across Roman allies' territory in Gaul. Instead of agreeing, Caesar decided to attack.
Caesar, of course, is a cynic. He needs a war, he needs the booty derived from that to finance his political campaigns. Before he goes on campaign in Gaul, he is deeply in debt. Gaul will provide the booty for repaying his creditors.
Caesar sent 6 legions against 360,000 men, women, and children. More than half the Helvetii were slaughtered, and the survivors forced to return to their homelands.
It was a part of the political struggle at Rome in the late Republic. Pompey, his great rival, was Rome's best general. So Caesar, competing against Pompey, he has to be a better general.
After dispatching the Helvetii, Caesar set after a German tribe that had crossed the Rhine and marched his troops 120 miles in 5 days to the Alsace region. Again, the Romans slaughtered thousands. Caesar then turned west towards Belgium and repeated the treatment against a tribe there. Caesar's political foes in Rome decried his actions, but most Romans cheered him on because he was defeating Gauls, the very same Celtic people who'd sacked Rome in 390 BC. The Roman fear of the Celts was more than historical. It was also physical.
Partly the sheer size of the Celts. The Italians were a fairly small people, and compared to them, the Gauls, for example, were absolutely enormous, you know, sort of 6-footers, that the Italians weren't used to. For example, we're told that Julius Caesar was tall for a Roman. He was only 5'6".
To the Romans, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek, like the Celts, was looked down upon as a barbarian, because their language sounded like sheep, bar, bar.
The Romans have a very particular view of themselves, and that is to see themselves as people who've developed the powers of the mind to control the body. Barbarians, on the other hand, are people who are led by physical desire, sex and drugs and rock and roll. They don't have a proper education, so they go for the nearest thrill.
But the Celts that Caesar was fighting in Gaul were far from barbarians as we know the term. They lived in organized towns, like this reconstruction in France, and they were master ironworkers who probably invented the chainmail armor that the Romans adopted. And the Celts' artwork was anything but barbaric. It's still regarded as one of the great artistic traditions of Europe. As warriors, the barbarians were no match for Caesar's well-trained legions. Celtic warriors did not fight as a unit. They fought for individual glory.
The big men liked to show up dressed in fancy, shiny armor, stand at the front, and engage in warfare that was no doubt fairly brutal, but was fairly small scale. They couldn't plan total war in the way that the Romans could plan. They didn't have fully trained legions. They didn't have logistic backup.
Also, the Celts were up against a brilliant commander in Julius Caesar. He was ambitious, hungry for victories, and used daring and original tactics.
He was noted for the speed and surprise of his movements, and he really brought those techniques to perfection in using his legions. On the other hand, he was a little reckless. Part of his daring, and he often got himself into terrible scrapes, but he was so quick and so perceptive of the enemy's intentions that he was always able to get himself out.
From the word go, he was prepared to adapt. I mean, coming up against the Germans for the first time in his first campaign, enormous numbers of cavalry, he had virtually none. No problem, he simply gets in horses and tells one legion, right, boys, you're all going to be cavalry. Suddenly has 5,000 cavalry.
Caesar knew he asked a lot of his soldiers, and so he went out of his way to cultivate an intense loyalty from them.
He didn't ask them to do anything that he didn't do, and he often dismissed his bodyguard and had his horse led away and actually stood in the ranks with the troops. And his troops were very loyal to him.
Not surprisingly, these loyal soldiers were also becoming wealthy soldiers through booty and slaves. The spoils of war were often won through great brutality. Caesar himself boasted that his campaigns in Gaul left 1 million dead and 1 million enslaved.
Caesar just carried out what I've called actually a big game hunt. He took his legions back and forth across Gaul, slaughtering troops, pillaging towns, killing women, children. The Romans were terribly cruel on the Celts.
Defeated enemies were often made into slaves. Slavery was tremendously important to Rome. 40% of the Italian population were slaves.
Slaves are fundamental to Rome's war effort. Essentially, slaves free the Roman citizen to fight in the army. Without slavery, it would have been impossible for Rome so effectively to initiate these wars of conquest.
Caesar's wars of conquest went on for 9 years. He was the ultimate example of everything the Roman army had become in its first 500 years. Dedicated, ambitious, ruthless. And Caesar would not stop with foreign conquests. With his army behind him, he would conquer his enemies in Rome and take the title of dictator for life.